being able to track your wellness, sleep hours, sleep quality, mood, fatigue, muscle soreness. These are things that are related to dance, but also not, right? And I think if you have a good idea of where you are at baseline, you will have a better idea of like where you can push, because we do have to push, right? To be performing and training at an elite level, there has to be some tolerance of discomfort, but not tolerance of discomfort to the point where it is detrimental to your well-being as not even a dance, but as a person.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Unchoreographed podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jenna Lower, and today I am so excited to have one of my really good friends with me, Robert Tsai. One of my favorite things about this podcast is that you guys get to listen in on real conversations with me and my friends in the dance medicine space. And so I'm really excited to bring him on today to be able to have one of these chats that I feel like we've had many times before. He's a wealth of knowledge, and you get to hear a little bit, a peek inside into how he treats his dancers at dance prehab. So, Rob, if you want to just give the people a little background, tell them who you are.
Good morning, Jenna. Yes. Good morning, everybody. Hello from Orange County, California. My name is Rob. In my life currently, at this moment, I am a physical therapist, and I'm very lucky and privileged to say that life has allowed me to kind of insert myself into our dance community here in Southern California, but more specifically the youth dance community. Previously, I taught a lot in this community at different studios when I was dancing professionally up in LA, so it's nice to have witnessed and seen the changes over time in this community over the last 10, 15 years and ongoing, and kind of tailoring our conversations and our approaches based off of these like long-term changes, right? My primary dance background is varied. I started with breaking and hip hop, and then before that I actually played baseball for a really long time, and I walked into a dance class my sophomore year of high school. So I learned dance from not so much of a ballet, jazz, tap perspective as most people would have in the US. I grew up in Taiwan, and so when I was in high school, I learned to dance from very, very much so a cultural perspective. So modern dance as a reflection of at the time, a rejection of like very formal technique, right? Looking at more pedestrian type movements, and then learning about ballet as a reflection of 16th century French and Italian courts. And then my first and foremost foray into dance was breaking. And so when I learned about breaking, I was like, where did this come from? And so learning about 1970s social political energies and how that impacted minority groups and how that eventually created hip hop and then created dance. And so I think learning about dance from different cultural perspectives has really informed me about the way I approach care and talking about care at the moment. Just being able to recognize that there are the things that we need to do, but also understanding why we do the things we do in terms of dance, in terms of health, in terms of people, and then how can we, by understanding where we have been and where we come from and why we do the things we do, we can influence better behaviors for in our practices, right? Like dance, health, and wellness. What are our beliefs about health and wellness, and how has our past experiences informed that, and ultimately, like, why are we the way we are, and being able to understand that, and so we can talk about the things that need to happen on the individual level, in our sort of local community level, but also on the global level as well. So that's a little bit about myself and just kind of what's always going on here in my brain.
No, I love it. I think that that's a really interesting perspective to bring into it about, I think it's important to be taking into consideration culture and, the social norms and all of that. I think that's a really interesting take on everything too. I don't know that we've ever had that conversation, so I'm learning things about you as we're as we're talking today, which is amazing. Well, so Rob, one of the things I feel like that caught my eye most about you before we were friends, before I knew you, one of the things that caught my eye most about you was I felt like you had this really unique approach in at treating your dancers. I saw you on Instagram, and I remember like watching your videos and thinking, wow, he has this like really different approach to cross training and rehab, and the thoughts and things that you were saying, kind of explaining things. I just loved to listen to your explanations of things. For instance, like I feel like you refer to this a lot of, treating the dancer as a human first. So many of those little things like that just really caught my eye about you. And I'd love to pick your brain a little bit more about kind of staying in the cross training space today with our conversation, but sort of what your view is and the role that cross training plays in the dance medicine space.
Yes. Let's start
It's a loaded question.
So there are so many ways to approach this, but I think first and foremost, thank you for your kind words. I think that's, generally speaking, a lot of this, the comments I get is like, oh, how, even in terms of creativity and approach and like things like that, it's like, where does that come from? And honestly, when I think about it, it just comes from looking at the person in front of you, and the human in front of you, right? And I love that this idea of the dancer, but also the human behind the dancer is gaining like much more traction, at least in like social media spaces, right? I want to preface this by saying that the experience that I think has informed me the most about just working with people in general was my pediatrics rotation during PT school. I was working specifically with early intervention kiddos, and so ages between like 1 and 3, and you're talking about working with kiddos that may not have the same cognitive and physical capacity as someone who's like developing normally, and you can't really communicate with them. You can't really reason your way through like why we're doing this. And so everything is nonverbal, and everything has to do with creating an environment. How are you enticing them to move in a certain direction? How are you promoting a movement choice? Whether or not it's conscious or unconscious, right? Like, how do you get them to do those things? And how do you create their environment, or how do you facilitate a space where they will then, which will then result in those actions, which will then result in strengthening, right? Yeah. So I would say that even to this day, when I think about, for example, if we're doing like an ankle rehab or working with any sort of lower extremity, like knees, hips, ankle, foot, everything, at some point it's taking the sterility out of exercise and letting the body make its choices and being comfortable making those choices, right? So I think one thing people tend to say is like, oh yeah, all like the tennis ball stuff I do, which I picked up a lot of what I do from the youth strength and conditioning community just at large, and this idea of being able to take people out of their preconceived notions of movement and to really sort of look at how they're reacting. That's their most honest self. And so then if I'm asking you to chase this ball, it might not be necessarily dance specific, but you are using skills that you are going to need to be able to perform well, right? Not just in dance, but as a human as well. So going back to your cross-training conversation, I think I really take this, we'll do the resistance training and strength training aspect of it, but then on the other part of it, if I see a dancer, we can define a dancer as like, you're a dancer. But we can also see them from the perspective of you are a young human who has chosen dance as your method of expression and moving throughout the world. And you're learning your life lessons through dance. And so I think it gives us the ability to look at a dancer, but also understand that like dance is a part of them, but there's also all these other parts of them that we can sort of acknowledge and perhaps, allow them to acknowledge it, right? As far as like identity goes. So with that said, I think being able to structure rehab and training around this idea of, hey, these are not necessarily dance movements, but these are movement qualities that you are going to have to understand, like how to navigate, right? Learning how to move slow is one thing, but moving fast, learning how to accelerate and decelerate, learning how to be powerful versus learning how to be still. These are not inherently dance-specific qualities, but these are human qualities. And so if we can get them, my opinion is that like if we can get them to appreciate that larger picture, you expand their perspective, and I think give them you expand their perspective, but more importantly, you give them a movement identity, or perhaps like sow the seeds of a movement identity beyond dance. And maybe that can lead them to like other paths of life somewhere down the road, right? They might not see it in like a week, they might not see it in like a year, but 4 or 5 years from now, it's like, hey, remember that thing you said way back when? Like, I finally get it. And I'm like, yes, amazing. So
we love those light bulb moments.
Yeah. So I think when you say cross training, I think that's kind of where ultimately my brain goes, is we're doing the dance thing, but let's not forget about the human things, and understanding that the human things is ultimately going to influence the dance thing, right? Mm-hmm. Something I've been saying recently, because I feel like it makes a little bit more sense, is whether you're running, jumping, skipping, or staying low to the ground or moving slowly, you have to navigate gravity. So, I think a really nice way to just kind of give like an overarching idea is like, well, how's gravity treating you right now? Or how are you resisting gravity, right? And I think that gives them that analogy gives them a different framework to think about movement rather than positional, right? Rather than here, do the exercise like this, put your hip here. It becomes more about, how am I adjusting, shifting, adapting, pivoting, and then allowing that to be slowly ingrained as part of their mindset so they can see beyond dance. Yeah.
I think that's amazing. Whether it's dance that's very technique heavy or it's the cross training world, I feel like there is such an emphasis on technique and like this idea of like, oh, my movement's got to be perfect and my posture has to be perfect, and like, oh, don't do this, don't do that, and to just allow the dancer or the human or the athlete or whoever it is to just explore movement versus this idea that there's like, this is how you squat and this is how you don't squat. But to just let them explore movement, I mean, it's so important. And I feel like that I see that come through in the way that you work with your dancers, for sure. This like exploration of movement.
Yeah, it's always, and I think that's going to depend on goals too, right? It's not just like, we're like the antithesis of dance, and we're just like on the opposite end of the spectrum. I think there are different areas to fill, and so, and I think that for me continues to be an exploration of, how does all of this make sense? And I think if we were to go back to our previous mention of like culture and how these social energies have influenced, it's how do we make cross training, resistance training, all the outside of dance training, how do we make that make sense for dance, but also how do we make that make sense for the dance family, and how do we make sense of that for the pre-professional dancer, right, or just any dancer, really. So I think being able to talk about the spectrum of movement and say, yes, there are moments that we do have to focus on the technique because we want to have, we still have to focus on technique at some point.
Right.
But I would argue that, if there was like a training or a movement experience for younger dancers, that was solely focused on technique and didn't really talk so much about the ability to make decisions and make their own decisions, then, you know, are we continuing to perpetuate this idea of like, oh, we need to be perfect, we need to have proper technique, and if I don't have proper technique, I'm doing it wrong, right? I mean, even in past conversations, we've had to this idea of like perfectionism and how might, you know, I guess I will err on the, I will always ask myself, you know, am I how do I say this? Am I creating an experience where the dancer is continuing to sort of tap into that side of themselves? Or can I take them out of that for a little bit, right? So if there's a dancer, let's say just personality-wise, if they're like really obsessed with like perfect technique, if they're really obsessed with, oh, I didn't get this last rep of 8, and I'm going to do like 17 more until I get the perfect one, then I'm like, hey, there's an issue there. Let's call it in, and how can we talk about this? And then depending on the personality and depending on the conversations I need to have, we find a way to have a discussion about, like, why are you doing that? Like, why do you feel like you need to get this last one? And I'm not saying I'm not going to ask an 11-year-old and be like,
Right.
excuse me, okay, dive into the last 11 years of your life, you know, 6 of which that you have been really more conscious, but
Yeah, right.
I think being able to know and offer a perspective that is a little less rigid, I think, just lets them understand that they can be less rigid, or that that's possible and that that's okay. So when it comes to that idea for the individual, right, just like understanding where you're coming from and why you have these perspectives, then how can we make your cross training more effective? I mean, there's the physical side where, yes, you do the technical things, but even for like the mental side, the emotional side, sometimes it's just nice to do something fun, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like there's such a fine line between this like idea of perfectionism and having the freedom to explore the movement. There really is this fine line. And in the dance world, you know, I work with a lot of ballet dancers, pre-professional ballet dancers. And so like perfectionism is a huge issue, I guess, in the, you know, I mean, for lack of a better term, I think it's sometimes more problematic than anything else. And the way that they're trained is very, and again, technique is important, but it bleeds into all these other areas of their life of like, we see dancers, you know, this very type A personality and everything's got to be just so. And so, yeah, like we run into that issue of like, you give them this cross training program, you're working with them. And sometimes it totally does, I think, backfires a little if you're not careful, where now they're like so hyper focused on, no, they said I have to use this weight and this rep and like, and it is really hard to balance that from a dance medicine professional standpoint, but then also like putting yourself in the dancer's shoes and how do we teach them to figure out how to balance that in their training and in their life. It's tough.
Like just being able to find ways to help them, once again, acknowledge kind of like what they're feeling and sometimes bring that up to the surface, but ultimately sort of like honoring your human self. And I would say this, at this point, we're talking about human capacity, right? You're just trying to understand, and how do we help them understand that energy is most certainly finite, and how are we being purposeful about the ways that we train. And in order to be purposeful about that, I think once again, we have to dive back into like why have we come to the place that we have, and how do we sort of begin to, I don't want to say like break it down or like reject it, but how do we acknowledge it so we know how to move forward with intention and purpose, right? So, and we talked about like the individual and having to talk to them about like not harping so much on like the technique side and understanding where these personality traits come from, but I think as a community, understanding of like where cross training and strength and conditioning belong, not in the sense of like, is it right for dancers? It's absolutely right for dancers. It's right for anybody, really. But how does it belong in terms of like scheduling? How does it belong in terms of administrative organization, right? If there are resources that we need to allocate, how does it belong in terms of like a training plan, and where does it belong with, once again, that finite energy that we have? And so something I've been trying to be better about in terms of like education, like families and students too, is talking about the idea of like load management and knowing the idea of, how much is too much, and providing actionable strategies. And it's a lot, it's work. It's absolutely work. Like you kind of have to do the thing to be able to see like what's happening, because we're talking long term, right? A few things that I think are good tools is being able to, for example, track wellness, like daily well-being parameters. There's a couple of different ones that are floating around in the youth training space, but primarily we're looking at aspects such as sleep quality, sleep hours, mood, fatigue, and muscle soreness. And there's like a rating scale. There's a bunch of different rating scales, but based off of those rating scales, there's, at the very least, there's like, oh my God, I don't feel so good, I feel really bad, to like, oh, I feel normal, to like, I feel great. And so if there are, if this is, and I know a lot of dancers and just people in general are interested in like tracking trends or like habit tracking and things like that. So for those dancers, it's helpful to be like, oh, wow, my sleep has been great for the last couple of days, and I can see how that's like influencing my performance. Or my hydration, now that we're in the middle of nutcrackers and whatnot as of this recording, right? I think being able to say, okay, so how has your hydration been? How are you keeping track of those things? And I think that just gives them a nice framework to kind of begin to explore. Whether or not they adhere to these things is another story, and that's, but the ones that do, I think, get a lot out of it because they're able to like identify trends, and they're able to see long-term just what it's been like, because we can look back to September and be like, oh yeah, like that was rough because, we came back to dance and it was like, go, 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 right? And then they can see how it like kind of chills out for a little bit because everyone's numbers are like, I nerd out on Google Sheets, and so I color code everything, and so like they report, if it's like a good number, it's like green, but obviously if it's like a not so fun number, it's a little bit more on the red side, and so they can see those trends for themselves, right? And so now they can see, okay, yeah, we're in the thick of it. I need to make sure like my sleep isn't good, like this isn't good, not to just like say like, oh, these are bad things, but it gives them a starting point, a place where they can acknowledge those things that they need. The other part would be RPE. I think rate of perceived exertion is a really great way, and that's how a lot of people in the strength and conditioning community, work, right? And I think we do see that more and more on the professional level, where they're talking about, okay, if you're doing an exercise, sets, reps, load, right? How many times you're doing something, and how many total sets are you doing? What's your weight? And then being able to rate all of those things. It's tedious, yes, but I think as a learning experience, it's really nice for dancers to say, okay, I want you to hit like a 7 out of 10 RPE today. I don't have the exact verbiage for it, but I will tell them that being able to know that you're working well is going to be like a 7 or an 8, where you are exerting a good amount of energy that is still recoverable. Or the other one would be the 2 reps in reserve, right? If I say, what's your like absolute max? They're like, oh, I'll do like 8, and then I'm a dead, and I'm like, all right, cool, let's do 6, right? And so I think giving them those like little parameters to kind of work with, or at least educating them about it, at least gives them an idea of, okay, this is how I can sort of gauge where I'm at. the next step in this just comes down to application, which is the toughest part, because you're asking them, do I have them like rate their day? Do I have them rate every single class? Do I because that's where I think that's the depth of which coaching gets to, or at least strength and conditioning, is that they'll be like, every single exercise, this is what we're doing. I think I do it with them, with the kiddos that I teach, just to give them an idea of, oh, okay, I am working just as hard, right? Sometimes you look at the sets and reps. So there were a few instances where, they did less sets and reps, but because they were focused on the number of how much they did, they felt like they were doing less. And if they felt like they were doing less, they inherently just began to think like, oh, I'm not as good as I was last week. But then we can talk about, but your effort is still the same. You're doing, you said 7 out of 10 last week with 3 sets of 8. I'm using 3 sets of 8 as an example. You rated a 7 out of 10 effort for 3 sets of 8, and then this week you're rating a 7 out of 10 effort for 3 sets of 6. That's fine. You're still giving the same effort. Let's look back. How were you tracking your sleep? How was your muscle fatigue? How was your soreness? And then they can see like, oh, my sleep wasn't as good this week, or I'm definitely more sore this week because I did X, Y, and Z. So, oh, that makes sense now why I'm doing less this week, but it feels so much harder. And I think, going back to my earlier comment about making it make sense, it's a lot of moving pieces. But when it clicks, and they're like, oh, okay, now I know that just thinking about how much I'm doing isn't the best way to gauge myself. It's also looking at where my efforts are. So, and this is the long game, right? So I think being able to provide, not just the information, but the experience of being able to retroactively look back on things and let that inform future behaviors or future perceptions is sort of where our efforts are currently, at least in the educational realm. That was a lot. Sorry.
Oh, but it's so good. I mean, it's so good. Because like I am also I'm a huge fan of the RPE, 2 reps in reserve, all of that. I actually have a really good research study that I actually will like show my dancers. I'll link it in our show notes because I think that it breaks it down in a very simple way for people to understand. So I'll link it in there if dancers don't really know what this whole RPE situation is. But I am a big fan of it as well. I have found, because like I feel like, again, you touched on like the schedules, everything's so demanding. Our dancers are overwhelmed, right? Yeah. And so I think sometimes we present this idea to them like, hey, like we're going to look at these, we're going to track this, we're going to do this. And sometimes they're like amped up about it. They're like, yes, let's go, let's do this. And then other times I've seen like the color drain out of their face and they're like, and now I'm more overwhelmed. And obviously that's not our intention. So like even for those dancers, I'd be curious to see what you think. What I've found is I'm like, let's pick one variable, and we'll pick the variable that seems to maybe be the thing that you're struggling the most with. Maybe you've been really stressed. Let's track just your stress. Let's pick one thing. That's what we're going to track. And then when they start to get familiar with it and get comfortable with it, they're like, oh, this isn't that bad. Okay, let's add another thing. Let's track sleep. So what do you think? Is that kind of what you do? Do you have another idea around like how to not increase the overwhelm by adding these things in, because they are really important?
Yes. No, I think the way you described it is kind of what I mean. I don't know if I necessarily. Thinking back on it now, that's what I do. I haven't consciously thought about like, oh, that's what I do. But now that you've mentioned it, I was like, yeah, because I think being able to pick small things to be able to demonstrate an idea or like demonstrate a possibility and then building up on that. So, being able to, once again, who is the human behind the dancer? The human behind the dancer is a child, and the child is still cognitively developing. So cognitive load is a thing. And I think trying to help them find something that is consistent across the board is so valuable, because it just doesn't teach them exercise, but it teaches them, like, good for now and good for life. So, even in terms of exercise selection, right? I mean, we'll work on a lot of different things in our sessions, but I always like to say, what are your top three? If you forget everything we talked about, what are your top three? And they can just go back to that. Then hopefully that allows them to continue to build that idea of consistency and accountability for themselves. But it's true. No, we're just. I will, during our sessions, we'll always like work on a variety of things, but then when they're out on their own before they come back, I'm like, hey, these are the things you're working on, so you can come back and we can continue to make things a little bit more complex. But I'm not trying to make things as complex for their like home exercise program than it is in our sessions, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think that whole idea of being able to choose what is most important to them and to be able to help them make sense of it is huge. Had a recent dancer I was working with, and we're talking about hydration, but they also happened to be taking a biology class. So I'm like, great, let's talk about biology. Let's like what, and so, we talked about like, oh, okay, if you have to, and they had mentioned that one of their goals was like, oh, my cardio is like not as good, so I'm like trying to like, run and like do all these things. And my thought process to them was like, okay, let's talk about biology since you have an exam soon, right? If you need cardio, what do you need to your body? Like, well, oxygen. Okay, great. And then what delivers oxygen? Okay, blood. Awesome. Yes, we're on the right track. And then if you're not drinking water, is your blood like free flowing, or is it a little bit more muddy and viscous? They're like, it's a little bit more muddy and viscous. And it's like, does that deliver oxygen better to you or worse? And so then I think being able to kind of like pick these little examples that they have in their life and what are they currently experiencing, and then being able to draw analogies for them in that way. I'm like, this is low, at least in this case, it's like low risk, high reward. Drink water. Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So being able to, I think, find little examples in their lives and then being able to connect those dots, I think, is huge. And I think that's always why, I'm interested in what you're doing in dance, but I'm also really interested in what you're doing outside of dance. Because that is meaningful to you too. So how can we take those things that are meaningful and then inform ourselves of our behaviors and habits and have that translate over to obviously dance, but perhaps translate to like other things later in life, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I feel like I could talk to you all day long. This is such good information for our dancers. I hate to have to cut it off because I really feel like we could keep going. There's so many things. Maybe we'll have to do a part 2 eventually, but I think these are all really good little nuggets of wisdom for our dancers to start to consider. I think it's really, some of these things are sort of outside of the norm of what we think of when we think of cross training. So hopefully this has given some different perspective on things.
I think, I know we talked about being actionable and, what are some things that I feel like are important for dancers and dance families and anyone to think about really is, we have finite energy, and more is not always better. Better is better. I can't remember where I heard that quote, but I've heard it multiple times from like different sources. And I think just being able to, it might be uncomfortable, but sometimes you're sitting there and you're thinking about, why am I the way I am? Why do I feel like I am not, why do I feel like I'm not performing to the best of my ability? Why am I feeling like, what I'm trying to say is like, why do I feel the way I do? And sometimes we are a little bit more self-deprecating or hard on ourselves as artists. And so what are the experiences I have had that are informing me about this? And what are the things that have been said to me that make me feel a certain way? And is that helping me or is that hurting me? And if it doesn't, how do I find the resources that are available? I think a lot of this begins to bleed over into like mental health a little bit. And so I know for as physical therapists, we're always thinking about, there are things that we can do. Provide a positive environment, provide a learning environment. But at some point, there are moments where I'm like, okay, this is beyond my scope of practice. We need to talk to somebody who is actually an expert in this area. So I think actionable, going back to actionable, keyword actionable, I think it's just knowing that we have finite energy, and are we choosing to do something because it is edifying to us, or is it because we're trying to chase like a result that we don't know what we're chasing, right? It's like flexibility. How much flexibility is enough? Everyone wants to get more flexible, but why? Is it, did we see something? Did someone say something? Has something been an issue for a long time? Let's talk about it. And how can we set goals that make sense, right? We would all love to have more sometimes, but how do we listen to our bodies and say, okay, my body is asking me to stop, or my body is asking me to listen to itself, and how do I do those things for me? There are a lot of different ways. I think we were talking about like load and things like that, so there are a lot of different ways to measure that. But if you're thinking about even just the human aspects, right? Being able to track your wellness, sleep hours, sleep quality, mood, fatigue, muscle soreness. These are things that are related to dance, but also not, right? And I think if you have a good idea of where you are at baseline, you will have a better idea of like where you can push, because we do have to push, right? To be performing and training at an elite level, there has to be some tolerance of discomfort, but not tolerance of discomfort to the point where it is detrimental to your well-being as not even in dance, but as a person. So I think being able to have honest conversations about that, and being able to find your communities and find your people to be able to have those types of conversations, I think is probably the most actionable thing right now on a communal level, right? Everyone's solution will be different, but what we can all agree on is that there need to be more spaces where people can feel comfortable and transparent, and to be able to not just like air out grievances and like complain and things like that, but to say, okay, we all feel this way, why? Mm-hmm. And where are the resources that we can find? And there are lots of us around.
There are. We're all here. We're waiting for you.
Always rooting for everybody. So.
Well, Rob, you are such a wealth of knowledge. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. This was amazing. Like I said, I feel like we already need to do a part 2, because there's just so many things that I want to ask and hear from you. But thank you so much for being here. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope you've all received some really actionable things that you can take home.
Yes, yeah, or at least, sowed some seeds and thinking about some things about how to move forward with intention, with purpose, with openness, with transparency, and with a learning mind.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Unchoreographed. I hope you found today's conversation insightful and inspiring. And if you enjoyed the show, it would mean the world to me if you could go to your favorite podcast platform and leave me a review. Your feedback helps us reach way more dancers just like you and keeps the conversation going. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode, and share this with all your fellow dancers who could use a little extra inspiration today. Until next time, keep moving with purpose and with passion, and I'll see you on the dance floor.